The 18 months since October 7th, 2023 have served as a grim reminder that wars are much easier to start than stop. Just as Hamas attacked Israel with no plausible prospect of victory, so Israel's response has been longer on what it is fighting against than what it is fighting for. On January 19th, a ceasefire was agreed in Gaza. Some of the Israeli hostages still kept by Hamas were released, as were thousands of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. That ceasefire has not held. At least 1,000 people are reported to have been killed in Gaza since Israeli military action resumed on March 18th, and ground operations by the Israel Defense Forces have escalated, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowing to seize further territory inside the Gaza Strip. At the same time, Israel has renewed its campaign of airstrikes against targets in Lebanon associated with Hezbollah, this week killing Hezbollah official Hassan Badir and 3 others, and targets in Syria, which Israel claims represent potentially menacing military infrastructure. Reports from Syria suggest that this week's Israeli raids destroyed 2 military air bases. But the reasonable question of where this all ends still does not have a coherent answer. Suggested futures for Gaza have seemed somewhere between fantastical and implausible, whether US President Donald Trump's fever dream of a gaudy resort or an Arab-backed plan perhaps overly reliant on the willingness of international partners to invest in the goodwill of Hamas and the competence of the Palestinian Authority. Why has Israel returned to war? Is Netanyahu just the proverbial man with a hammer to whom everything resembles a nail? And how and when does this all end? This is the Foreign Desk.
As long as the Palestinians are divided between West Bank and Gaza, as long as Hamas is somehow involved in Gaza, paradoxically, it takes the pressure off Israel. So there is a strategic thing that is in line with Netanyahu's thinking by maintaining the crisis type of warfare in Gaza.
You've still seen international efforts trying to create palatable plans that they think the Israelis will buy into. Even Hamas itself has offered to decommission their weapons, not have any role in the future of Gaza. We've had Egyptian assurances of that, and that still hasn't been enough to get Israel's buy-in.
I don't think there's going to be peace with the Israelis in my lifetime, and even if there were, how do you solve the problem of the 500,000 Palestinian refugees who are in Lebanon? Any real peace treaty with Israel has to address that. Otherwise, what's the point for Lebanon?
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Nimrod Goren, Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute, founder of the Israeli foreign policy think tank Mitvim. He joins us from Jerusalem. Nimrod, first of all, if we look at the recent resumption of hostilities, not just in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and Syria, do there appear to be genuine military/strategic reasons for starting this all up again?
I think it happens in a very different way in each of the fronts that you mentioned, because on Gaza there was a very clear decision by Netanyahu early in the war not to go for a formal end of war as long as Hamas is in power. So even when Netanyahu signed the ceasefire agreement that spelled different phases, it was quite clear here in Israel that after phase 1, Netanyahu will go back to fighting, because the condition of ending the war is not something that he is agreeing to. And by doing that, he's basically jeopardizing the remaining Israeli hostages that are still in the hands of Hamas. So that's kind of Gaza. On Lebanon, actually, things are going in a bit of a better trajectory because there was a ceasefire. It kind of formally ended without anything permanent being in place. But the rhetoric, I think, on both sides, or the wish to stabilize and change the reality, I think is now shared on both ends of the border after the political change in Lebanon and the aim by the new leadership in Beirut to sideline Hezbollah, to stabilize, to go for reconstruction. You hear it also in Jerusalem. The foreign minister spoke today about normalization with Lebanon. So even if that's too early, we are talking about more about diplomacy than about active warfare. Syria, on the other hand, is where Israel is really projecting force and going much beyond it ever did, attacking within Syrian territory, being present within Syrian territory, really trying to shape what's transitioning within Syria to Israel's favor, or at least at how the government sees that. But by doing that, creating a lot of tension with the new leadership in Syria and also with Turkey, that is now a power actor in Damascus.
But if we look at Gaza in particular, because that's been the focus of the renewed fighting, does it look like the IDF is being sent to act here in, the imperative of Israel's defense, or are they actually basically going in there looking for things to do? One operation underway is this one to take back the Morag corridor, as it's called, between Rafah and Khan Yunis in the south of the Gaza Strip. Does there appear to be any particular military urgency for doing that?
There's a lot of criticism within the Israeli society of there not being clear enough military strategy or diplomatic strategy, perhaps, because the majority of the Israeli public before the fighting resumed was in favor of ending the war for return of hostages. And the return of the hostages is the key issue within the Israeli debate. It's not about a yearning for peace. Unfortunately, that's not where society is. People want to see Hamas gone. They want Israel to win over Hamas. But they see that almost 60 people are still held there. And we, on a daily basis, we hear the testimonies of those Israelis that were released on what they've been going through and on the medical conditions of those who are still there. And for the public, this is a priority. And Netanyahu is going here against the will of the general public, but feeds into his far-right coalition that wants to see resumed fighting, more control over territory, more enhanced military presence within the Gaza Strip. So there is kind of this paradox within the Israeli discourse that leads the IDF to act, but nobody really understands where it's going and why it's needed now, and that could be achieved now that wasn't achieved in almost a year and a half of high-intensity fighting.
I mean, you've hit there on what is the most cynical interpretation of Netanyahu's motives, not just now, but over the last 18 months, that he is acting principally in the interests of keeping his own coalition together and thereby at least partially in the interests of keeping himself in power and therefore out of prison. Do you think it really is that simple, though, or does he have any kind of imaginable end point in mind, some idea of what a future relationship with Gaza might look like?
There is a policy and strategy, and I think we have Netanyahu in power for quite a long time, so we can look at his track record and see that one of the constant factors in Netanyahu's conduct is to prevent any chance of the establishment of a Palestinian state. Okay, and that's an end game. He has another end game on Iran, the nuclear project, dismantling that or preventing that, and preventing the Palestinian state. So his actions in Gaza are basically geared towards not enabling the day after scenario that the international community wants to see, that brings a reformed, empowered Palestinian Authority that is now ruling the West Bank back into ruling the Gaza Strip instead of Hamas, with support of Arab countries, of the international community, eventually paving a way to reality in which Palestinian statehood becomes relevant again. As long as the Palestinians are divided between West Bank and Gaza, as long as Hamas is somehow involved in Gaza, paradoxically, it takes the pressure off Israel. So there is a strategic thing that is in line with Netanyahu's thinking by maintaining a crisis type of warfare in Gaza, not willing to do the unity between the West Bank and Gaza as others in the region want to. But I think more and more the concern in Israel is the calculations are because of political and personal motivations rather than the national security good. And it's not only about the maintaining the coalition, because the coalition is rather stable and most of its fractions do not have other options to go to politically. But Netanyahu is in quite a bit of trouble. Look, now as we speak, he's visiting Orban in Hungary. It's almost the only country that he can visit without getting arrested, okay? And his top advisors are now arrested by the police for interrogation about, thing they did with Qatar. And next week, there is a Supreme Court appeal against his decision to fire the Shin Bet, the national security chief. So a lot of boiling point, I think, over Netanyahu that he's trying to manage or contain, also by diverting attention to military action. That's part of the thing. But again, there's also an ideological, strategic thinking of his that is not new.
But for everything you've just listed there, this extraordinary litany of domestic political problems, which I think would probably have crushed most politicians long ago, the fact that he spent 18 months now waging a war with no perceptible end in sight, Do you think he nevertheless feels actually right now kind of emboldened, like maybe he's ridden out the worst of global anger against what Israel has done in Gaza, plus the fact that President Donald Trump has been restored to the White House in Washington, D.C.? Does he think that maybe he has the wind behind him?
Yeah, so first regarding the 18 months or so of the war, there was justification in Israel for the war. So even people who don't support Netanyahu understood that after the Hamas terror attack of October 7, Israel needs to go and protect itself, prevent this from happening again, take Hamas out of power, release the hostages. There was a general consensus on that. There was growing pressure and criticism on how Netanyahu is doing that and what are the real motives for that prolonging. On your question on the international community, I think the sense is that Israel is not facing that much of pressure now from the international community on what's happening in Gaza. Definitely, the policy of Donald Trump is not pushing Israel to change course. There was hope when Trump came into office that he will want to end the war and will put pressure for that. That's what he said in the campaign. His initial actions was to secure or help the Biden team even secure the first phase of the ceasefire in Gaza. So when the released Israeli hostages came back, they thanked Trump for making their release possible. The hope would have been that that pressure will continue to make it permanent, but that wasn't the case. Trump talked about a Riviera in Gaza, about taking the Palestinians out of there. So definitely giving Netanyahu the backwind to continue. And even within the European Union, in which there was traditionally value-based approach that was criticizing military action, calling for peaceful resolution, I think now there is much more openness towards engaging with the current Israeli government, a much more practical, pragmatic, transactional approach. So I'm not sure how much Netanyahu feels the pressure from the international community to a level that changes his calculation. That's not the case at the moment, and I think it impacts the way things are developing on the ground.
That was Nimrod Goren, Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. We're joined now by Tahani Mustafa, Senior Palestine Analyst at the International Crisis Group. Tahani, first of all, are we any closer now than we might have been at any point these last 18 months in terms of understanding what the future of Gaza might look like, say, 5 or 10 years from now?
Well, I think, for many of us that were following the shifting realities on the ground, we were certainly very pessimistic in our outlook in the way that we envision the future for Gaza, especially considering a lot of the statements coming from the Israeli establishment, who, particularly in Israeli media, were making no secret of how they envisioned the future of Gaza, which did not include any form of reconstruction, did not include any sort of political entity or viable political entity that could make life in any capacity inhabitable or normalized for Gazans. And at that point, even before we had seen the ceasefire take effect in January, back in October 2024, we had aid organizations that were already on the ground warning that the likelihood of seeing any form of reconstruction was practically nil. So I think for many of us, the assumption was always the best case for Gaza would be what we're seeing now, which is the creation of these quote unquote safe zones where Gaza's population or what's left of it will be clustered into smaller and smaller patches of territory dependent on aid for everything. And there have been different sort of envisionments from the Israeli side in how that's going to be administered, whether you have private security companies administering that aid or aid organizations themselves. But Israel's envisionment for the future of Gaza has, since the outset, this onslaught has never once included any viable entity, simply because it just simply does not want any possible governing authority that could ever threaten its sense of security again.
We have, in the last couple of months at least, seen one possible vision for Gaza's future, and this emanating from the imagination of US President Donald Trump, illustrated with an AI video he distributed, though it does seem that somebody initially made that as a joke at Trump's expense. Bizarre though the idea seems of turning the Gaza Strip into a kind of Mediterranean analogue of Atlantic City, did it at least prompt any other thinking among or around the Arab world in particular? Did anybody rise to the challenge of saying, here's our better idea?
Well, yeah, precisely. I mean, that was exactly the kind of catalyst that spurred on the Arab summit we saw on March 4th. And then from that, we saw the Arab Reform Plan, which Egypt has tried to take quite a lot of credit for, basically pointing it as the quote unquote Egyptian plan. But really what it is a combination of different sorts of contours of different plans that have been floated around from Arab states, the Palestinians themselves, and other sort of international backers of different sort of ideas of how we can have the Palestinian Authority that is currently governing the West Bank reinstated in the context of Gaza to ensure some form of reconstruction. That would also include Hamas decommissioning its weapons, in some instances leaving the Gaza Strip, if possible, ensuring that, you have a viable apolitical entity that can administer things like health, sanitation, education, oversight of reconstruction, trying to bring back normalization of life to the Strip. So that was really in response to the kind of ideas being floated. I wouldn't really call it a concrete plan from Trump's side, but there definitely was this idea of turning Gaza into practically a holiday resort, which really spoke to what some segments of the Israeli far right and settler communities had already been advocating publicly in the 17 months prior, where they were talking about the resettlement of parts of Gaza, creating these beach resorts, creating these kind of lucrative condos and property development projects. So that really spoke to certain segments within Israeli society that had already been advocating for the resettlement of Gaza.
I mean, the ideas that emanated from the Cairo summit, as you point out, did call for things like, well, all the obvious stuff that Gaza is going to need, like reconstruction, administration, security, police, etc., all of which is going to be fearfully complex and expensive to deliver. But even above and beyond that, is the ultimate hurdle not going to be that Israel will be the final veto on whether any of that ever happens? And if that is the case, is there a way around that?
Well, precisely, and that has been the frustration amongst international circles that have been involved around the kind of planning process of what's to come next in Gaza since the 7th of October. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that this idea of planning some kind of regime change and reform for Gaza didn't just start after open warfare. I mean, this was something that had already been floated around 8th of October. But the frustration coming from the international community, and that includes Western states, including states that are quite closely allied to Israel, was precisely that, was at each stumbling block was because it just simply couldn't get the buy-in from Israel. And without that buy-in, you really can't have any plan take effect. The West Bank is a great example of that. I mean, everything from, speed humps has to be approved and greenlit by Israel before anything can really be installed in the context of the West Bank, and the same goes for Gaza. So there was a lot of frustration around that Israel effectively shut down every potential prospect, to the point where you had international planners complaining that what the Israelis were demanding was to effectively have the international community dance to their tune while also footing something like $80 billion, which is what many have now estimated it will cost to reconstruct and reinstate some kind of governing entity in the context of Gaza. But, in any case, you've still seen international efforts trying to work around that, trying to create palatable plans that they think the Israelis will buy into, to the extent where even Hamas itself has offered to decommission their weapons, not have any role in the future of Gaza, in the governing of Gaza. We've had Egyptian assurances of that. You've had numerous deals signed to that effect, brokered by Russia, China, as well as Egypt. And that still hasn't been enough to get Israel's buy-in. And so this recent reform is also experiencing the same stumbling block, which is the money is there, the international community are ready, they've crunched the numbers, the logistics are already starting to be thought through, but really it's the fact that Israel's complete reluctance to buy into any sort of future for Palestinians in Gaza is what's really just kind of unraveled a lot of this planning and thinking.
I mean, while that standoff continues, at the heart of this, obviously, are 2 million, give or take, people living in the Gaza Strip in conditions of barely imaginable horror, which are obviously not improving. There have, of course, been fever dreams from the Israeli right, from President Trump, about removing temporarily, probably in inverted commas, some or all of those people. And it's very difficult to imagine certainly any Arab state being willing to take them. But has there been any conversation at all about what would be in Gaza right now a definite non-zero number of people who actually want to leave. Will they ever be entitled to that option?
Well, at the moment, Israel has sealed off the Strip completely, which has made it difficult to leave. Even when people were able to leave, where you had some modicum of movement between the Egyptian and Gazan border, I mean, the ridiculous prices that the Egyptian side were charging per head was insane and was completely inaccessible for a lot of Gazans. So the option to really migrate at that point wasn't an option available to many. Those that could did end up leaving, but the majority either weren't able to, or, for many, the sentiment was that they'd rather die on their land than live the indignity of a refugee elsewhere. And they know full well, I mean, this isn't just about the reluctance of regional states to take them in, but it's also the fact that, even in cases where they have taken refugees in, either from Palestine, Syria, Iraq, they've never really integrated or assimilated into these societies and have faced, huge amounts of discrimination. And, Gazans are fully aware that that will be their fate. And so, as I said, for many, that sentiment is still very strong. This idea of dying with dignity on your land rather than having to live the indignity of being a refugee elsewhere.
As a final question then, and even asking it seems like an exercise in almost deranged optimism given the discussion we've had, there have been over the last 18 months various hopeful voices suggesting that perhaps out of this horror, the idea of a two-state solution might be revived. From where we are sitting now, does that strike you as even vaguely possible?
I don't think the two-state solution has ever been implausible. I think there definitely has always been the hope for it. It may not necessarily be within the contours of the Oslo Accords, which is what the last 3.5 decades have seen that track towards a two-state solution centered around. But there definitely still is the demand for a two-state solution. I think now, after October 7th, more than ever, I don't think many Palestinians, even those that were on the side of a one state, can really envision that as a reality anymore, considering the deep kind of animosity between the two communities since the 7th, where you've had on the one side calling for the complete annihilation and quite physically seeing it happen in Gaza. So for many Palestinians, the idea of being able to live side by side with Israelis, and I'm sure Israelis feel the same way post October 7th. So I think now more than ever really does call for a two-state solution where there is a demand for segregation on both sides. But if we're talking about the kind of two-state solution that has been on offer to Palestinians since the 70s, then that is not acceptable for many Palestinians, simply because what is being demanded is that it's not self-determination, it's self-autonomy is what is effectively being offered to them. You're not talking about a sovereign state where Palestinians will have full control over their own air, land, and sea. They're not going to have any sort of security establishment to protect themselves. It's going to be a demilitarized state, which has been one of the conditions. And that also then gives Israel guarantees and assurances that they can conduct military operations whenever they see fit, which is completely unacceptable considering, I think, especially over the last 17 months, the levels of violence we've seen inflicted in giving Israel that kind of green light without needing to provide any sort of premise or basis to do so. So that to Palestinians is unacceptable. So really, it's not the issue of a two-state, it's what the substance of that two-state really is about. And if it's what's been on offer since the 1970s, then today, I think, before October 7th, Palestinians were far more willing to accept that as a reality. Today, not so much.
That was Tahani Mustafa, senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Benjamin Netanyahu has spoken more than once these last 18 months of a desire to remake the Middle East, even if he has been maddeningly unclear on what it will look like when he's done. But he has already changed things, advertently or otherwise, in Lebanon. Israel's decapitation of Hezbollah, including the elimination of long-serving leader Hassan Nasrallah, has eased the restoration of something at least resembling a Lebanese government. I'm joined finally by Faysal Itani, a Senior Director of Middle East Programs at the New Lines Institute and an Adjunct Professor of Middle Eastern Politics at Georgetown University. Faysal, first of all, before these more recent airstrikes on Lebanon, do you think Lebanon had got to a point where it thought it was all over, at least for the moment?
No, I don't think so, to be honest with you. I think there's a kind of dichotomy in Lebanon where people feel one of two things very strongly. Either they feel very cynical and jaded and they don't believe there's any room for growth or change. And there are quite a few Lebanese who feel, because of what happened, like because things were so shaken up with the war, and then there was a new president and there's a new cabinet, etc., that there is kind of some hope for working towards better future. How much better? It depends on who you ask. There's some people who are like much more humble in what they want to see. They just want to see electricity. And there are others who talk about, we got to disarm Hezbollah. And, obviously that's much more ambitious. I mean, they're both ambitious, but that's more, more dangerous as a policy direction. So I don't know. There is some kind of weird kind of hope that I don't usually see there. I just came back from a meeting with a bunch of people who were there, and I did sense this, and it surprised me a little bit. But I defer to the people on the ground to tell me how they feel. Right? I've got my own opinions, obviously.
I mean, there are a couple of things there to unpack and others besides, but where Hezbollah in particular are concerned, that Israeli strike earlier this week did kill Hassan Badir of Hezbollah and his son and a couple of other people. Do we know yet really how diminished Hezbollah are by the last year and a half or so in between Israel's more conventional offensive into Lebanon and the targeting of a large cohort of its officer class with exploding pages?
Yeah, so look, if you're Israel and you're measuring, or if you're Hezbollah and you're measuring your situation vis-a-vis Israel, it's very poor because you've lost a lot of your trusted, senior, experienced leadership. I think they lost almost all of it, actually, during the war. And they lost, I think, a few thousand people. It's hard to say how many, but a significant amount of, seasoned, good fighters. And I think they lost almost all, or at least most, of their medium to long-range arsenal, the big weapons, basically. So if you're looking at it from a Hezbollah versus Israel perspective, I think there's no match at all. If you're looking at it as a Hezbollah versus everybody else in the country thing, then this is different, and you calculate the balance of forces in a different way. So there's no one in Lebanon that could feasibly go and confront a group with, 15,000, experienced fighters and like 30,000 small arms. And it's still, on a local level means something different than what it means on the Israel versus Hezbollah level.
I mean, nevertheless, this week we did see or hear from Hezbollah threatening retaliation against Israel for that strike, and I suppose Hezbollah at the very least feels professionally obliged to issue a condemnation of that sort. But as far as anyone can tell, are they still capable of mounting what they might once have thought of as a serious retaliation against Israel?
They have options that could trouble the Israelis. They can do it from within Lebanon. They can do it inside Israel. They can kill people and disrupt life. But I think the cost will be so high on them that they don't want to do it, as far as I can tell. But they're not going to stop, operating against the Israelis, because if they stop doing that completely, then basically this is a concession that they've lost the war and the battle is over. This is something they're not ready to say. Them or Iran, I'm not sure, but somebody's not ready to say it. And so we're going to see them continue operating. Therefore, we're going to see the Israelis continue to go after them in this kind of targeted way that they usually do over the past few weeks. But they can still do damage, but they have to calculate whether it's worth the cost. So if they go and they fire things that they've been holding on to for a long time, they're expensive and complicated. They don't know where they're going to get their next, shipment of ballistic missiles. Or ballistic rockets. So do they want to go and fire them and gain what? They haven't really found a solution to this new version of Israel, militarily. And until they do, it's not in their interest to really escalate that much.
I mean, are they further constrained by the fact that, as you were saying earlier, Lebanon does now have an actual government after a while of not really having such a thing? And one of the things that government has pledged to do is, well, as they put it, ensure that Lebanon's own armed forces are the only military force in the country, which does imply a determination to disarm Hezbollah.
Yes. So this is a bit of a delicate dance on everybody's side. For the Lebanese government, for a number of reasons, partly for international reasons, and partly because there's a lot of people in the government office who dislike Hezbollah, and partly because the head of the armed forces himself is a very supremely confident person who thinks like the LAF is, the greatest institution in the country and all this. So all of them are going to be to different degrees pushing on Hezbollah. Some people want to push very, very hard, with the idea that if Hezbollah is weak, now is the time to go after them. The others are saying, no, we'll push, but if we push too hard, this will turn into a different kind of problem, and they're going to attack us, and then we're going to have a civil war in the country. So they have to keep on checking themselves and their impulses. And same thing with Hezbollah. So Hezbollah, first of all, just militarily got very weakened. That's one. Two, the very fact that this government and president exist is because Hezbollah decided they can't fight it because they didn't want either of these guys. And so they gave up and let it happen and worried more about their core security interests instead. And they're going to want to push back and they're going to want to do what they want to do, but they can't do everything. I mean, they have, their community was devastated by this war, the Shia community in Lebanon. And others are looking for it to make a mistake. And they know that. They're not stupid. So they have to also restrain themselves. Everybody has to restrain themselves a little bit, basically.
We were talking earlier about Lebanon's new government and maybe some of the less dramatic but more basic things that do need attending to, like making sure Lebanon does have reliable electricity, running water, that kind of thing. Is there any sense that inroads are being made into those very, very basic things of life?
The only inroad that's been made is that this cabinet exists. Other than that, they don't have a real budget yet. Okay, so they don't have a budget. They have one officially, but it's a long story, but it doesn't really count. Then they have to, they have to save the financial sector of the country. That means going after the banks, the politicians, It's just almost mission impossible. It's very difficult. If you still have these guys lying around in power, how do you get them to do those things? So I don't think anything's actually been accomplished other than the election of a cabinet that in theory is capable of doing it. And in practice, probably, I think, does want to do it. There's some kind of genuine, sincere... well, having said that, a lot of people in the cabinet are, of course, from the old guard. But doing things like, the boring stuff is actually very hard because it's all tied up with the macroeconomy. And all of that is tied up with the kind of gangster state that's been built up in Lebanon, even without Hezbollah, even if you solve the Hezbollah problem tomorrow, you still have this problem, which is that the country's been run like an organized criminal enterprise for a long time, with constituencies and stuff. So that's difficult to break through.
I did want to try concluding with what may seem like an optimistic note, although I guess your views on whether it's optimistic may vary fairly greatly within Lebanon. But Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, who, again, we have to admit the possibility that he was just kind of trolling, was speaking in Paris earlier this week, spoke of the prospect of Israel and Lebanon normalizing relations. Is that something that, one, strikes you as actually feasible, and two, would occasion scenes of great rejoicing in the streets of Beirut?
Well, like with everything, I think different Lebanese would react differently to this one. I think the majority of Lebanese don't like Israel and don't want to make peace with them, but they don't want to fight them, and they don't want this kind of open-ended war with them. They want to carry on their lives and build their country, which is understandable. There are some people who think this is actually like a good idea. Most of the time they say, we're past this issue, it's done. Plus there's money to be made, if you open the economies up to one another, and maybe there is. But the default position of most people in Lebanon is they don't like the Israelis, even the ones who hate Hezbollah. So that's another, that's a thing that I think is complicated by outsiders when they look at Lebanon. Not all outsiders, but many. And they see this kind of like westernized, country where Hezbollah is unpopular, etc. That's fine, but a lot of people have their own reasons not to like the Israelis. I don't think there's going to be peace with the Israelis in my lifetime. And even if there were, how do you solve the problem of the 500,000 Palestinian refugees who are in Lebanon? Any real peace treaty with Israel has to address that. Otherwise, what's the point for Lebanon? And the Israelis are, of course, not going to take these people back. So I don't know how that goes. Anyway, it doesn't matter what I think, because if there's an attempt to do this, there is going to be a civil war in Lebanon, because Hezbollah will fight to stop it. And, who wins that war, I don't know. But this has been tried before in the 80s by the Israelis and certain factions in Lebanon. It didn't work out very well. It's not mission impossible, but I don't think the ingredients are there for it to work.
That was Faysal Itani, Senior Director of Middle East Programs at the New Lines Institute. Thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.